in the dense forests of North Carolina's Appalachian Mountains, where ancient Cherokee legends still whisper through the trees, some discoveries are meant to test the very core of human compassion. When seasoned hunter Thomas Crowfeather set out on what seemed like an ordinary October morning in 1987, he had no idea that the faint crying he would hear echoing through the misty hollows would lead him into a confrontation with evil that would challenge everything he believed about justice, revenge, and the old ways of his people. What he found abandoned in a muddy creek bed wasn't just a helpless victim. It was the beginning of a story that would prove some curses are real, some debts must be paid, and some hunters become the hunted when they choose to protect the innocent. This is the true account of how one man's decision to show mercy unleashed a chain of events that would bring an ancient Cherokee justice to those who thought they were beyond the reach of any law. Thomas Crowfeather had been walking these mountain trails since he was old enough to hold his grandfather's hand. At 52, his weathered face told the story of countless dawns spent in these ancient forests, tracking deer along paths that his Cherokee ancestors had carved centuries before European settlers ever set foot in these hills. The October air was crisp and clean, carrying the earthy scent of fallen leaves and the promise of winter's approach. His breath formed small clouds as he moved silently through the underbrush, his worn leather boots finding their way automatically along the familiar terrain. The morning had started like any other hunting expedition. Thomas had risen before sunrise, prepared his gear with the methodical care his grandfather had taught him, and offered a quiet prayer to the spirits of the forest, asking for a successful hunt and safe return. He carried his father's old hunting rifle, a weapon that had provided for 3 generations of his family, and wore the same faded camouflage jacket that had seen him through 20 years of seasons in these woods. But as he made his way deeper into the forest, following a game trail that wound through a grove of ancient oaks, something felt different. The usual forest sounds seemed muted, as if the very trees were holding their breath. Birds that should have been singing their morning songs remained silent. Even the insects seemed to have abandoned their usual chatter. Thomas paused, his instincts sharpened by decades of experience, and listened carefully to the unusual quiet that surrounded him. It was then that he heard it, a sound so faint and distant that at first he thought it might be the wind playing tricks on him. A soft crying, almost like the mewling of a wounded animal, drifted through the morning air. Thomas tilted his head, straining to locate the source of the sound. It seemed to be coming from somewhere ahead and to his left, in the direction of Crying Creek, a small waterway that meandered through this section of the forest. The crying continued, growing slightly stronger as Thomas changed direction and began making his way toward the creek. Something about the sound troubled him deeply. In all his years in these woods, he had heard the distress calls of countless animals: injured deer, trapped foxes, birds separated from their flocks. But this sound was different. There was something almost human about it, something that made his chest tighten with an inexplicable sense of urgency. As he pushed through a thick stand of mountain laurel, the crying became clearer, and Thomas felt his blood run cold. It wasn't an animal at all. It was definitely human, and it sounded like a child. He quickened his pace, his hunting instincts now completely focused on reaching whoever was making those heartbreaking sounds. The underbrush tore at his jacket as he hurried forward, branches catching at his sleeves and thorns scratching at his hands, but he barely noticed. The creek came into view through the trees, its shallow waters flowing clear and cold over a bed of smooth stones. The autumn rains had been heavy that year, and the banks were muddy and soft, carved into deep ruts where the water had risen and receded over the past few weeks. Thomas scanned the area quickly, his eyes searching for the source of the crying, which had now become a weak, intermittent whimpering. Then he saw her. About 30 yards downstream, partially hidden by an overhanging willow tree, a small figure lay in the mud at the water's edge. Thomas felt his heart skip as he realized what he was looking at. It was a little girl, no more than 3 or 4 years old, curled up in the thick, cold mud like a discarded doll. Her tiny body was barely visible beneath a layer of brown silt, and she was shivering uncontrollably, her small arms wrapped around herself in a futile attempt to find warmth. Thomas dropped his rifle and ran toward her, his boots splashing through the shallow water and slipping on the muddy bank. As he got closer, the full horror of what he was seeing became clear. The child was naked, her small body covered not just in mud but in bruises and scratches that spoke of terrible mistreatment. Her dark hair was matted with dirt and debris, and her face was so swollen and discolored that it was difficult to make out her features. She looked up at him with eyes that should have been bright with the innocence of childhood, but instead held a depth of pain and terror that no human being, let alone a child, should ever have to experience. Those eyes, dark and haunting, seemed to look right through him, as if she had already seen more evil than most people encounter in a lifetime. Thomas knelt beside her in the mud, his voice soft and gentle as he spoke in Cherokee, the language his grandmother had always used when comforting frightened children. He told her that she was safe now, that he was going to help her, that no one would hurt her anymore. The little girl didn't respond with words, but something in her eyes shifted slightly, as if some small part of her was choosing to trust this stranger who had appeared out of the forest. Very carefully, Thomas lifted her from the mud, wrapping her in his hunting jacket. She weighed almost nothing, her small body feeling as fragile as a bird's in his strong arms. He could feel her ribs through her skin, evidence that she had been starved as well as abused. As he held her close, she pressed her face against his chest, and he felt hot tears soaking through his shirt. The walk back to his truck felt like the longest journey of Thomas's life. Every step was measured and careful, as he tried to keep the child as comfortable as possible while navigating the rough terrain. She had stopped crying now, but she clung to him with a desperation that broke his heart. He found himself talking to her continuously, maintaining a steady stream of gentle words in both Cherokee and English, hoping that the sound of his voice would provide some small comfort. When they reached his pickup truck, parked at the old logging road that served as his usual starting point for hunting trips, Thomas faced his first real decision. He could drive straight to the hospital, which would mean involving the authorities immediately. Or he could take her home first, where his wife Mary could help clean her up and assess her condition before deciding on the next step. The hospital was the logical choice, but something about the child's condition and the circumstances of finding her made him hesitate. As he started the engine and began the drive down the mountain, Thomas found himself thinking about his grandmother's stories. Tales of children who had been touched by evil and needed special care to heal properly. His grandmother had been what some people called a medicine woman, though she had never used that term herself. She had simply been someone who understood that some wounds went deeper than the physical body and required healing that modern medicine couldn't provide. The little girl had fallen asleep in his arms, exhausted by her ordeal, but even in sleep her face was troubled, and she made small sounds of distress. Thomas made his decision. He would take her home first, let Mary tend to her immediate needs, and then they would figure out the best way to help her. Mary Crow Feather was hanging laundry on the line behind their modest home when she saw Thomas's truck coming up the gravel driveway much earlier than expected. She knew immediately that something was wrong by the way he was driving slowly and carefully, as if he was carrying something precious and fragile. When he got out of the truck and she saw what he was carrying, her face went pale with shock and concern. Mary had raised 5 children of her own and had helped deliver dozens more in the community over the years. She had seen her share of injuries and illnesses, but the sight of this tiny, brutalized child left her speechless for a moment. Then her maternal instincts took over, and she was moving, clearing the kitchen table, boiling water, gathering clean towels and blankets. As they worked together to clean the little girl and tend to her wounds, Thomas told his wife about finding her in the mud by the creek. Mary listened with growing anger and sorrow, her gentle hands never pausing in their careful ministrations. The child's injuries were extensive, bruises in various stages of healing, cuts that had been allowed to become infected, and evidence of systematic abuse that made both adults feel sick to their stomachs. But as they worked, something remarkable began to happen. The little girl, who had been silent except for occasional whimpers since Thomas found her, began to respond to Mary's gentle touch and soothing voice. She opened her eyes and looked directly at Mary, and for the first time since her rescue, something that might have been hope flickered in her dark gaze. Mary sang to her as she worked, old Cherokee lullabies that her own grandmother had sung to her when she was small. The child seemed to recognize the language, and gradually her tense little body began to relax. When Mary offered her a cup of warm broth, she drank it greedily, as if she hadn't tasted food in days. It was while they were trying to coax her to eat small bites of bread that the child spoke her first words. Her voice was barely a whisper, hoarse from crying and dehydration, but the words were clear enough. They said the spirits would punish them if they kept me. They said I was cursed. Thomas and Mary exchanged glances over the child's head. In Cherokee tradition, there were indeed curses and protections, ancient ways of ensuring that justice was served when the regular world failed to provide it. But these were not things that civilized people in 1987 talked about seriously. They belonged to the old stories, the legends that were told around campfires but not really believed in the light of day. The little girl continued, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. My mama told them I was special before she died. She told them the old ones were watching over me. but they said I brought bad luck. They said terrible things would happen to anyone who hurt me, but terrible things would happen to anyone who kept me too. As the day wore on, more of the story emerged in fragments. The child's name was Sarah, and she was indeed Cherokee, though she had been living with distant relatives after her mother's death from cancer 6 months earlier. These relatives, motivated by a combination of superstition, poverty, and plain cruelty, had decided that they could no longer care for her. But rather than take her to social services or find her a proper home, they had chosen to abandon her in the forest, telling themselves that if she survived, it would prove she wasn't really cursed. Thomas felt a cold anger building in his chest as he listened to Sarah's halting account of her ordeal. These people had left a small child to die in the wilderness because of their ignorance and superstition. But as his anger grew, he also began to remember his grandmother's teachings about the old ways, the ancient Cherokee beliefs about protection and vengeance that most modern people had forgotten. His grandmother had told him that there were indeed curses in the old tradition, that they were not arbitrary or cruel things. They were a form of cosmic justice, a way of ensuring that those who harmed the innocent would face consequences for their actions. She had also taught him that sometimes these curses needed human agents to help them along, people who were willing to serve as instruments of justice when the regular world failed. As night fell and Sarah slept peacefully for the first time in weeks, wrapped in warm blankets on the crow feathers couch, Thomas sat on his front porch and thought about what he had learned. He had the names of the people who had abandoned her. Sarah had been able to tell him where they lived and who they were. He had evidence of abuse and abandonment that could send them to prison for years. But as he sat in the darkness, listening to the night sounds of the forest and feeling the presence of his ancestors in the mountain air around him, Thomas began to think that prison might not be enough. Some crimes, his grandmother had taught him, required a different kind of justice. Some people needed to learn lessons that only the old ways could teach. The next morning, Thomas made 2 phone calls. The first was to social services, reporting the discovery of an abandoned child and beginning the process of ensuring that Sarah would be properly cared for. The second call was to his cousin James, a man who still remembered the old traditions and had never quite forgotten the ways their grandparents had settled certain types of disputes. When James arrived that afternoon, the 2 men sat with Sarah and listened as she told her story again, this time in more detail. They learned about the family that had taken her in after her mother's death, how they had blamed her for every piece of bad luck that befell them, and how they had gradually convinced themselves that she was indeed cursed and needed to be gotten rid of. But they also learned something else, something that made both men exchange significant looks. Sarah's mother had indeed been special in the old tradition. She had been what their grandparents would have called a beloved of the spirits, someone whose life was under particular protection, and that protection, according to the old beliefs, extended to her children. As James prepared to leave, he turned to Thomas with a grim smile. "You know what needs to be done, cousin. These people have violated something sacred. They've harmed a child who was under protection. That kind of thing doesn't go unanswered in the old ways." Thomas nodded slowly. He had been thinking the same thing all day. "How long do you think it will take?" "Not long," James replied. "The spirits are already at work. I can feel it. All we need to do is make sure they know exactly who they're dealing with." That evening, as Mary tucked Sarah into the spare bedroom that would be her home for the foreseeable future, the little girl looked up at her new guardian with eyes that seemed older than her years. "Will they come looking for me?" she asked quietly. Mary smoothed her hair and smiled. "No, sweetheart, they won't. Your Uncle Thomas is going to make sure of that. Are you going to hurt them?" Mary considered the question carefully before answering. "We're going to make sure they understand what they did wrong. Sometimes people need to learn lessons the hard way." Sarah nodded solemnly, as if this made perfect sense to her. "Mama always said the spirits protect children like me," she said. "People who hurt us would be sorry someday." "Your mama was right," Mary said softly. "Now get some sleep. Tomorrow we're going to start making sure you have everything you need to be happy and safe." As Mary left the room, she found Thomas standing in the hallway, his face set in lines of grim determination. They had both made their decision. The authorities would handle the legal aspects of Sarah's case. But there was another kind of justice that needed to be served, the kind that ran deeper than any court system and longer than any prison sentence. The people who had abandoned Sarah in the mud were about to learn that some traditions never die, and some protections are older and more powerful than any law written by human hands. They were about to discover that when you harm a child under the protection of the spirits themselves will find a way to respond. And Thomas Crowfeather, the hunter who had found Sarah crying in the mud, was about to become the instrument of an ancient Cherokee justice that would teach them the true meaning of consequences. 3 days after finding Sarah, Thomas stood at the edge of Crying Creek where he had discovered her, but this time he was not alone. His cousin James had brought 2 other men with him, Daniel Kingbird and Robert Standing Bear, both descendants of Cherokee families that had never fully abandoned the old ways. The 4 men formed a circle in the exact spot where Sarah had been left to die, their faces solemn as they prepared to perform a ceremony that few people alive still remembered. Daniel, who served as a keeper of tribal traditions in the community, had brought with him items that had been passed down through his family for generations: eagle feathers blessed by his great-grandmother, tobacco grown in sacred ground, and stones that had been used in ceremonies for more than 2 centuries. Robert carried a drum made from deer hide, its surface decorated with symbols that spoke to powers older than written history. As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the forest in shades of gold and crimson, the men began the ritual that would set ancient justice in motion. They had spent the previous day consulting with the few elders in the community who still remembered these practices, seeking guidance on the proper way to invoke protection for an abused child and consequences for her abusers. Thomas had learned the names and address of the family who had abandoned Sarah. They were distant relatives on her father's side, people named Marcus and Helen Littlefoot, who lived in a run-down trailer about 20 miles deeper in the mountains. Sarah had told him how they had slowly turned against her after her mother's death, blaming her for their financial troubles, their health problems, and even their truck breaking down. In their minds, warped by poverty, ignorance, and perhaps their own guilty consciences, the small girl had become a scapegoat for every misfortune in their lives. But what Marcus and Helen didn't understand was that by abandoning a child who carried the protection of the ancient spirits, they had not freed themselves from bad luck. They had guaranteed that it would find them with interest. Cherokee tradition held that certain children were born under special protection, and anyone who harmed such a child would face consequences that grew with each passing day until justice was finally served. The ceremony began with Thomas recounting the full story of finding Sarah, speaking in Cherokee as he described her condition and the evidence of abuse she had endured. His words carried the weight of a formal accusation, a calling upon the spirits to witness what had been done to an innocent child. The other men listened in silence, their faces growing darker with each detail. When Thomas finished speaking, Daniel stepped forward and began a chant that his family had used for generations to call upon protective spirits. His voice rose and fell in an ancient rhythm, the words seeming to echo through the trees and across the water, with a power that made the hair on the men's arms stand up. He called upon the spirits of all Cherokee children who had suffered unjustly, asking them to watch over Sarah, and to ensure that those who had harmed her would face the consequences of their actions. Robert's drum began to beat, a slow, steady rhythm that seemed to match the heartbeat of the earth itself. The sound carried through the forest, and gradually other sounds began to join it: the hooting of owls, the rustle of leaves in the wind, and distant calls of night birds that seemed to answer the drum's ancient voice. As the ceremony continued, each man took a turn speaking his intention aloud. They were not asking for supernatural intervention in the modern sense, but rather invoking an old form of justice that worked through natural consequences and the interconnectedness of all living things. In Cherokee belief, those who violated the natural order would find that order turning against them in ways both subtle and profound. James was the last to speak, and his words carried the weight of someone who had spent years studying the old traditions. "We do not call for violence," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the night air. "We do not ask for immediate destruction. But we ask that these people who abandoned an innocent child in the mud should face the true consequences of their actions. Let them understand what it means to be abandoned. Let them experience the fear and helplessness they forced upon a little girl. And let this understanding come to them in ways they cannot ignore or explain away." When the ceremony was complete, the men buried the tobacco and other offerings at the base of the willow tree where Sarah had been found. They marked the spot with a small cairn of stones, each one representing a promise to protect her and ensure that justice was served. As they prepared to leave, Thomas felt a change in the atmosphere around them, as if something ancient and powerful had awakened in response to their call. The next morning, Thomas received a phone call from a social worker named Patricia Williams, who had been assigned to Sarah's case. Patricia was a practical woman who had dealt with hundreds of abuse cases over her 20-year career. But something about Sarah's situation had affected her more deeply than usual. She wanted to meet with Thomas and Mary to discuss the little girl's placement and recovery. When Patricia arrived at the Crowfeather home that afternoon, She found Sarah playing quietly in the backyard, building small houses out of sticks and leaves, while Mary tended her garden nearby. For the first time since her rescue, the child seemed relaxed and at peace, no longer flinching at sudden movements or startling at unexpected sounds. "She's already made remarkable progress," Patricia observed as they watched Sarah through the kitchen window. "Usually children who have endured this level of trauma take months to begin trusting adults again. But she seems to have bonded with you and your wife almost immediately." Thomas nodded, pouring coffee for his guest. "My grandmother always said some children are stronger in spirit than others. Sarah has been through terrible things, that there's something unbreakable inside her." Patricia opened her case file and began outlining the legal process ahead. The authorities had already located Marcus and Helen Littlefoot based on Sarah's statements, and charges were being prepared. But what Patricia described next made Thomas set down his coffee cup with a surprised expression. "It's the strangest thing," Patricia said, consulting her notes. "When the sheriff went to interview them yesterday, he found them in a state of complete panic. Apparently, ever since they abandoned Sarah, they've been experiencing what they describe as a series of escalating disasters. Their trailer caught fire 3 days ago, the same night you found her, but the fire department couldn't determine a cause. The flames seemed to start and stop randomly, damaging different parts of the home, but never spreading in a logical pattern." Thomas felt his pulse quicken, but he kept his expression neutral. "That does sound strange. It gets stranger," Patricia continued. "Helen Littlefoot has been having what she describes as vivid nightmares every night since Sarah disappeared. She dreams that she's a small child again, lost in the forest and calling for help while adults walk away and refuse to hear her. She wakes up screaming and can't get back to sleep. And Marcus claims that he's been hearing crying sounds coming from their well, even though they've had it inspected and there's nothing wrong with it." Mary joined them at the kitchen table, her face carefully composed. "Fear can make people imagine all sorts of things," she said diplomatically. "True," Patricia agreed. "But there have been other incidents that are harder to explain away. Their truck broke down on a mountain road 2 days ago, and when the mechanic looked at it, he said the engine had seized up in a way he'd never seen before. All the metal parts had somehow rusted through overnight, as if they'd been sitting in salt water for years instead of running fine the day before." Thomas exchanged a quick glance with his wife. The ceremony had only been performed the night before, but it seemed that forces set in motion by their ritual were already at work. Or perhaps the consequences had begun the moment Marcus and Helen had made their cruel decision to abandon a protected child. Patricia continued her account. "Yesterday morning, Helen went to their vegetable garden and found that every single plant had died overnight. Not withered or diseased, actually dead, as if something had sucked the life right out of them. The soil itself has turned black, and nothing they plant will grow in it anymore. And Marcus," she went on, "has developed what can only be described as a compulsive fear of being alone. He can't sleep unless Helen is in the room with him, and he started having panic attacks whenever he's by himself for more than a few minutes. He keeps saying that he feels like something is watching him, waiting for him to be vulnerable." Thomas felt a grim satisfaction at hearing this news. Marcus and Helen were beginning to experience exactly what they had put Sarah through: the terror of abandonment, the fear of being alone and helpless, the sense that the world itself had turned hostile. But this was only the beginning. Over the following weeks, as Sarah continued to heal and grow stronger in the care of the Crowfeather family, Patricia provided regular updates on the continuing deterioration of her former guardians' lives. The series of inexplicable misfortunes that had begun immediately after Sarah's abandonment continued to escalate in ways that defied rational explanation. Marcus had been fired from his job at the local sawmill after a piece of equipment malfunctioned in a way that nearly killed him. The machine, which had worked perfectly for years, had suddenly started operating in reverse, catching Marcus's shirt and nearly pulling him into the blades before other workers managed to shut it down. The mill supervisor, unable to explain the malfunction and afraid of liability issues, had terminated Marcus on the spot. Helen had fared no better. She worked as a cleaner for several families in the area, but one by one her employers had let her go. The complaints were always the same. After Helen cleaned their homes, strange things would begin happening. Mirrors would crack for no reason, food would spoil overnight in working refrigerators, and children would wake up crying from nightmares about being lost in dark places. But the most disturbing development, according to Patricia, was the way their community was beginning to turn against them. Word had spread about their abandonment of Sarah, and neighbors who had known them for years were now crossing the street to avoid them. Their landlord had given them notice to vacate their trailer, claiming that other tenants were complaining about strange sounds and smells coming from their unit. It's as if they'd become pariahs, Patricia told Thomas during one of her visits. People who used to be friends won't speak to them anymore. Even their own extended family members have stopped taking their phone calls. They're experiencing a complete social isolation that's almost unheard of in such a tight-knit community. Thomas nodded thoughtfully. Social isolation was indeed one of the traditional consequences invoked by Cherokee justice ceremonies. Those who violated community standards, especially those who harmed children, would often find themselves cut off from the support systems they needed to survive. It was a form of exile that didn't require physical banishment. The community simply withdrew its acceptance and protection. Meanwhile, Sarah was thriving in ways that amazed everyone who met her. The shy, terrified child who had been found in the mud was gradually revealing herself to be bright, curious, and surprisingly resilient. She had begun attending a local school, where her teachers reported that she was remarkably advanced for her age, especially in areas that required intuitive understanding rather than rote learning. Mary had noticed something else about Sarah that she mentioned to Thomas one evening as they sat on their front porch after the little girl had gone to bed. "She knows things," Mary said quietly. "Yesterday, she told me that Mrs. Henderson's cat was sick before Mrs. Robbington died. Henderson even realized it herself. And last week, she warned me not to drive into town because something bad was going to happen on the road. I thought she was just being anxious, but it turned out there was a major accident right where she said there would be." Thomas wasn't surprised. In Cherokee tradition, children who survived extreme trauma while under spiritual protection often developed heightened intuitive abilities. It was as if their suffering had opened doors in their minds that normally remained closed, allowing them to perceive things that others missed. "My grandmother had the same gift," he told his wife. "She used to say that the spirit sometimes gave special abilities to people who had endured more than their share of pain. It was a way of balancing the scales, of ensuring that suffering led to wisdom rather than just bitterness." 1 month after the ceremony at Crying Creek, Thomas received an unexpected visitor. Sheriff Bobby Mankiller, a Cherokee man who served as the chief law enforcement officer for the county, arrived at the Crowfeather home on a crisp November morning with a grim expression on his weathered face. "I need to ask you some questions about Marcus and Helen Littlefoot," Sheriff Mankiller said without preamble as he settled into a chair at the kitchen table. "Strange things have been happening to them, and your name has come up in connection with their case."
Thomas poured coffee for the sheriff and sat down across from him, his face calm and open.
"I found the little girl they abandoned, if that's what you mean, and I've been helping with her recovery. But I haven't had any direct contact with them since then." "That's what I figured," Sheriff Mankiller said, accepting the coffee gratefully. "But I had to ask. See, these folks have been coming to me almost daily with complaints about things that make no sense from a law enforcement perspective. Their property keeps getting damaged in ways that can't be explained. They claim to be receiving threatening messages that no one else can see or hear, and they're convinced that someone is systematically destroying their lives." "And what do you think is really happening?" Thomas asked carefully. Sheriff Mankiller was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee cup. Like many Cherokee law enforcement officers, he found himself caught between the modern world of police procedures and evidence and the older world of traditional beliefs that many people in his community still held dear. "Off the record?" he finally said. "I think they've brought something down on themselves that goes beyond anything I can handle with handcuffs and court orders. My grandmother would have said they violated something sacred when they abandoned that child, and now they're paying the price for it." Thomas nodded slowly. "And on the record?" "On the record, I can't find any evidence of criminal harassment or vandalism directed at them. Whatever's happening to Marcus and Helen, it's not being done by human hands, at least not in any way I can prove or prevent." Sheriff Mankiller drained his coffee and stood to leave, but paused at the door. "Thomas, I want you to know that everyone in this community respects what you and Mary have done for that little girl. She's lucky you found her when you did. And if anyone asks, I'll tell them that you've been nothing but cooperative and helpful throughout this entire situation." After the sheriff left, Thomas walked out to his backyard, where Sarah was playing with a collection of dolls that Mary had bought for her. She looked up at him with eyes that seemed to hold depths of understanding far beyond her years. "Are they sorry yet?" she asked quietly. Thomas knelt down beside her, surprised by the directness of her question. "Who do you mean, sweetheart?" "The people who left me in the mud. Are they sorry for what they did?" Thomas considered his answer carefully. "I think they're beginning to understand what it feels like to be scared and alone. But true sorrow, the kind that leads to real change, that takes longer to develop." Sarah nodded solemnly and returned to her play. But Thomas noticed that she was arranging her dolls in a very specific pattern, one that reminded him of the protective circles his grandmother had drawn around their home when he was a child. Somehow, despite her young age and everything she had endured, Sarah understood that protection and justice were two sides of the same ancient coin. As winter approached, the consequences facing Marcus and Helen Littlefoot continued to intensify. They had been forced to move 3 times as landlords found reasons to evict them, and each new living situation proved worse than the last. Marcus had been unable to find steady work as word of his treatment of Sarah had spread throughout the tight-knit mountain community. Employers who might have overlooked other character flaws drew the line at someone who would abandon a child. But the most devastating consequence was the complete breakdown of their relationship with each other. The stress of their situation had caused them to turn on one another, each blaming the other for the decision to abandon Sarah. Their arguments had become violent, resulting in multiple police calls and a restraining order that left them separated and alone, facing their consequences without even each other for support. Thomas heard about their final downfall from Patricia during her last official visit to check on Sarah's placement. Helen has had what I can only describe as a complete emotional collapse, Patricia reported. She's been hospitalized for severe anxiety and depression, and she keeps telling the doctors that she can hear children crying in the walls. The medical staff thinks she's having some kind of psychotic break brought on by guilt and stress. And Marcus? Thomas asked. Marcus has simply disappeared. He abandoned their last apartment in the middle of the night, leaving behind all his possessions and telling neighbors that he couldn't stay in the area anymore because the mountain itself was against him. No one has seen him since. Patricia paused, looking out the window where Sarah was playing happily in the afternoon sunshine. You know, in all my years doing this job, I've never seen such a clear example of people facing the natural consequences of their actions. It's almost like the universe itself decided to teach them a lesson. Thomas nodded, thinking of the ceremony he and his cousins had performed at Crying Creek, and the ancient beliefs that had guided their actions. Sometimes, he said quietly, justice finds its own way of making things right. That evening, as the first snow of winter began to fall over the mountains, Thomas and Mary officially signed the papers to adopt Sarah as their own daughter. She would keep her birth name, but would legally become Sarah Crowfeather, a member of their family in every sense that mattered. As they celebrated with a quiet dinner that included some of Sarah's new favorite foods, the little girl looked up at her new parents with a smile that transformed her entire face. For the first time since Thomas had found her in the mud, she looked like what she truly was, a normal, happy child with a whole life ahead of her. Thank you for finding me, she said simply. And thank you for making sure they understood what they did wrong. Thomas and Mary exchanged glances across the table, both understanding that Sarah somehow knew more about the consequences that had befallen her former guardians than any 4-year-old should know. But in Cherokee tradition, children who survived great trials often possessed wisdom beyond their years and the ability to sense when justice had been properly served. 5 years had passed since Thomas found Sarah in the mud at Crying Creek, and the little girl who had once been abandoned to die had grown into a confident, bright 9-year-old who was the light of the Crow-Feather household. She excelled in school, had made many friends, and showed no obvious signs of the trauma she had endured in her early years. But Thomas and Mary knew that beneath her sunny exterior, Sarah carried a deep understanding of both human cruelty and the power of justice that most children never experience. It was on a crisp October morning, almost exactly 5 years after her rescue, that Sarah made a request that surprised both her adoptive parents. She asked if they could visit the place where Thomas had found her. She wanted to see Crying Creek again, not as a victim returning to the scene of her suffering, but as a survivor who needed to complete something that had been left unfinished. I need to thank them, she explained, as the 3 of them drove up the familiar mountain road toward the old logging trail. The spirits who protected me and who made sure those people learned their lesson. My birth mama told me before she died that if something bad ever happened to me, I should always remember to thank the spirits who helped make things right again. Thomas felt his chest tighten with emotion as he listened to his daughter speak. In the 5 years since her adoption, Sarah had rarely mentioned her ordeal or the people who had abandoned her. She seemed to have processed the trauma in her own way, with a resilience that amazed everyone who knew her story. But clearly, some part of her had been waiting for the right time to return to where her new life had truly begun. The forest looked different in the bright morning sunlight than it had on that misty dawn when Thomas had first heard her crying. Autumn had painted the trees in brilliant shades of red and gold, and a gentle breeze rustled through the leaves, creating a sound like whispered conversations between old friends. As they walked along the familiar trail toward the creek, Sarah skipped ahead of them, showing none of the fear or anxiety that Thomas had expected. When they reached the spot where he had found her, marked by the cairn of stones that still stood beneath the willow tree, Sarah became very still and quiet. She stood looking at the place where she had nearly died, and Thomas could see her young mind working to process the significance of this moment.
"It's different than I remembered," she said finally.
In my dreams, it was always dark and scary, but it's actually quite beautiful here. Mary knelt beside her daughter and wrapped an arm around her shoulders. Sometimes when we're frightened, we can't see the beauty that surrounds us, but it's always there, waiting for us to be ready to notice it. Sarah nodded thoughtfully and then did something that surprised both adults. She began to gather small offerings from the forest floor. Pretty leaves, interesting stones, a few late-blooming wildflowers that had survived the first frost. She arranged them carefully on the cairn that Thomas and his cousins had built 5 years earlier. "Thank you," she said aloud, addressing the forest around them in a clear, confident voice. "Thank you for protecting me and for helping Uncle Thomas find me. And thank you for making sure that the people who hurt me learned what it felt like to be hurt themselves." As she spoke, a red-tailed hawk circled overhead, its piercing cry echoing through the forest. In Cherokee tradition, hawks were messengers between the human world and the spirit realm, and Thomas took its presence as a sign that Sarah's words were being heard by the forces that had protected her. But what happened next was something none of them expected. As Sarah finished her thanks and turned to leave, they heard the sound of a vehicle approaching along the old logging road. Thomas tensed, his protective instincts immediately alert, but the truck that came into view was one he recognized. It belonged to his cousin James, who had helped perform the protection ceremony 5 years earlier. James got out of his truck with a serious expression on his weathered face, and Thomas immediately knew that he had news about Marcus and Helen Littlefoot. Over the past 5 years, there had been occasional reports about their whereabouts and condition, but the news had never been good. "I thought you should know," James said without preamble, glancing at Sarah to make sure she was listening. "Helen Littlefoot died 3 days ago. She was found in a homeless shelter in Asheville, completely alone. The staff said she had been talking about needing to come back to the mountains to make amends for something she had done to a child, but she was too sick to make the journey." Sarah absorbed this news with the same serious expression she wore when processing difficult school lessons. "Was she sorry?" she asked. James nodded slowly. "According to the people at the shelter, she spent her last weeks trying to find ways to contact social services about you. She wanted to make sure you were safe and well cared for. She kept saying that abandoning you was the worst thing she had ever done, and that she would never forgive herself for it." Thomas felt a complex mix of emotions at this news. Part of him was satisfied that Helen had finally understood the magnitude of her actions, but another part of him, the part that had been shaped by his grandmother's teachings about mercy and redemption, felt genuine sadness for a woman who had spent her final years consumed by guilt and regret. "And Marcus?" Mary asked quietly. "That's the other reason I came," James replied. "He showed up at the tribal council office yesterday morning, looking like he had aged 20 years in 5. He's been living rough in the mountains all this time, unable to find peace anywhere he went. He came to ask if there was any way he could make amends for what he did to Sarah." Sarah stepped forward, her young face serious and thoughtful. "What did you tell him?" James knelt down so he could look directly into her eyes. "I told him that any amends would have to be approved by you, little sister. You're the one who was wronged. You're the one who gets to decide if forgiveness is possible." Thomas felt his heart swell with pride as he watched his daughter consider this weighty responsibility. At 9 years old, she was being asked to make a decision that would affect the rest of Marcus Littlefoot's life. It was a burden that no child should have to bear, but Sarah had always been extraordinary in her wisdom and maturity. "Can I see him?" she asked after a long moment of thought. "Not to forgive him, not yet, but to see if he really understands what he did wrong." The meeting was arranged for the following week at the tribal council office, with Patricia Williams present as Sarah's advocate and several tribal elders in attendance as witnesses. Marcus Littlefoot arrived, looking like a broken man, his clothes tattered and his face gaunt from years of living on the margins of society. When he saw Sarah, healthy, confident, and clearly thriving, he began to weep. "I am so sorry," he said, his voice cracking with emotion. "I was scared and stupid, and I let my fear turn me into a monster. I left an innocent child to die because I was too cowardly to face my responsibilities. I know I don't deserve forgiveness, but I had to try to make things right before I die." Sarah studied him carefully, her dark eyes seeming to look directly into his soul. "Do you understand why what you did was wrong?" she asked. "Yes," Marcus replied without hesitation. I took a helpless child and abandoned her to die because I was afraid of things I didn't understand. I chose my own comfort over your life, and that was unforgivable. And do you understand what happened to you afterward? Sarah continued. Marcus nodded slowly. I think I was being shown what it felt like to be you. The fear, the helplessness, the feeling that the whole world was against me. I experienced what I put you through, and it nearly destroyed me. Sarah was quiet for several minutes, thinking carefully about what she had heard. Finally, she spoke in a voice that carried wisdom far beyond her years. I forgive you, she said, simply. Not because what you did was okay, but because you finally understand how wrong it was. And because my mama always taught me that holding on to anger hurts the person carrying it more than the person it's aimed at. The relief on Marcus's face was overwhelming to witness. Years of guilt and suffering seemed to lift from his shoulders as Sarah's words reached him. Thank you, he whispered. I don't know how to repay you for this kindness. You can repay me by never hurting another child, Sarah replied firmly. And by telling other people what happened to you when you abandoned me. Tell them that the old protections are still real, and that people who harm children will face consequences they can't escape or explain. Marcus nodded eagerly. I will. I promise you I will spend whatever time I have left making sure other people understand what I learned. As the meeting concluded, Thomas felt a profound sense that the circle of justice had finally been completed. The ancient Cherokee way of handling violations against protected children had worked exactly as it was supposed to. The guilty parties had faced consequences that taught them the true weight of their actions, and when they finally showed genuine repentance, mercy had been offered. But the story was not quite over. 3 months later, Thomas received a letter from a social worker in Virginia. Marcus Littlefoot had kept his promise to Sarah. He had begun speaking at churches and community centers throughout the mountain regions, telling his story and warning others about the consequences of child abuse and abandonment. According to the letter, Marcus's talks had prevented at least 2 cases of child abandonment that the social worker knew about, and possibly others. Parents who were struggling with unwanted children or difficult circumstances had been moved by his account to seek help through proper channels rather than take desperate, harmful actions. He always ends his talks the same way, the social worker wrote. He tells people that there are powers in this world that protect innocent children, and that anyone who harms such a child will face justice in ways they never imagined. He says he lived through it himself and wouldn't wish the experience on his worst enemy. Thomas shared this news with Sarah, who received it with the same thoughtful expression she wore when processing any important information. I'm glad he's helping other children, she said. That makes his suffering worth something. On the 6th anniversary of her rescue, Sarah asked to return to Crying Creek one more time. This time she brought her own offerings, drawings she had made throughout the year of families with happy children, photographs of herself at school events and birthday parties, and a letter she had written to the spirits thanking them for her life. As she arranged these items on the now familiar cairn, Sarah spoke aloud in Cherokee, words that Thomas realized she had learned from Mary without anyone teaching them to her. She was thanking the ancestors not just for protecting her, but for teaching her about the balance between justice and mercy, between consequences and forgiveness. The old ways still work, she said to Thomas as they prepared to leave the forest for what would be the last time. But they work because they teach people to change, not just because they punish them. The spirits didn't want Marcus and Helen to suffer forever. They wanted them to understand what they had done wrong and become better people. Thomas nodded, marveling at his daughter's insight. That's exactly what my grandmother used to say. Justice isn't about revenge. It's about teaching people to make better choices. As they walked back to their truck, Thomas reflected on the extraordinary journey that had begun with the sound of a child crying in the forest. Sarah had not only survived her ordeal, but had grown into a remarkable young woman who understood both the power of justice and the necessity of mercy. The ancient Cherokee tradition of protecting innocent children had worked exactly as it was meant to, creating not just consequences for the guilty, but opportunities for redemption and growth. Years later, when Sarah grew up to become a social worker herself, she would often tell her own story to families in crisis. She would explain how the old protections still worked in modern times, and how the consequences of harming children were as real and inescapable as they had ever been. But she would also emphasize that those same traditions made room for redemption when genuine remorse and change were demonstrated. Marcus Littlefoot continued his speaking engagements until his death from natural causes 7 years later. At his funeral, dozens of children and families attended, people whose lives had been changed by his warnings and his example of what happens when adults fail in their most basic responsibility to protect the innocent. And Thomas Crow Feather, the hunter who had found a crying child in the mud and set ancient justice in motion, lived to see his adopted daughter raise children of her own in the same mountains where she had once nearly died. The circle of protection that had saved Sarah continued through her own family and through the countless other families who heard her story and understood that some traditions are too important to ever abandon. The spirits that had protected Sarah and guided the consequences that befell her abusers continued to watch over the children of the Cherokee Nation and all innocent children everywhere. The old ways persist not because they are cruel or vengeful, but because they recognize that protecting children is the most sacred responsibility of any community, and that those who violate this responsibility must be taught, through consequences, through suffering, and ultimately through the possibility of redemption, to choose a better path. In the end, the story of the Cherokee hunter who found Sarah and struck back at those who had harmed her became a teaching story itself, passed down through generations as a reminder that justice is not abandoned simply because the world changes. Some protections are eternal, some responsibilities are sacred, and some debts can only be paid through genuine understanding and a commitment to do better. The crying that Thomas heard in the forest that October morning had led not just to the rescue of one child, but to the reaffirmation of an ancient principle that continues to protect innocent children today. And somewhere in the mountains of North Carolina, the spirits continue their eternal watch, ready to respond whenever a child's cry for help echoes through the wilderness.